The Supreme Court as an institution now is under attack for being too partisan.
This is, at some level, a global problem that requires a global solution, with America participating and leading.
You have to make the choice between if you are investing in police, or if you are policing as the total system, or if you are going to invest in community and care.
Tonight, it's the Northwestern News Network 2020 Election Show Special.
We'll hear from Congresspeople, students, and a former presidential candidate as we look at the issues and races influencing this high-stakes election.
All that and more coming up on NNN's 2020 Election Night Special.
It's your election coverage right now. Good evening and welcome to the Northwestern News Network's 2020 Election Night Special. I'm Joey Safchik.
And I'm Justin Sweetwood. Well, here we are, November 3rd, the day Americans have been waiting for. In a year so uncertain, tonight we begin to gain some clarity. Things might look very different by the end of the night, and things look different here on NNN too. We'd love to be in the studio breaking down all of the races live, but because of COVID-19, we're unable to do so.
Instead, we're proud to present our fully virtual Election Night Special. More than 24 of NNN's reporters and producers have spent the last few weeks covering the issues and races that matter most. To start things off, here's Zach Miller on what to expect with mail-in ballots.
This election, Americans will vote by mail in record numbers. So far, more than 50 million voters have already submitted their mail-in ballots, compared to only 33 million votes cast by mail in the 2016 election. The record-high early turnout shouldn't surprise anybody. Coronavirus infections have spiked over the last few weeks, scaring many voters away from the polls. But this election sets itself apart for a different reason. For the first time, support for mail-in voting is strongly divided by party. 68% of Trump supporters say they disapprove of voting by mail, compared to only 7% of Joe Biden supporters. President Trump and down-ballot Republicans are worried that mail-in votes will favor Democrats, and with good reason. Democrats have requested far more absentee ballots than Republicans, including in the key swing states of Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida. That's why for the past few months, President Trump has been trying to make it harder to vote by mail, and poisoning the well with accusations of voter fraud.
They're sending millions of ballots all over the country. There's fraud. They found them in creeks. They found some with the name Trump, just happened to have the name Trump just the other day in a waste paper basket.
Earlier, President Trump claimed on Twitter that foreign countries would submit millions of fraudulent ballots, a claim that FBI Director Christopher Wray told Congress was unfounded. Voter fraud is exceedingly rare, but individual instances tend to get a lot of press coverage. Former Arkansas governor and one-time presidential candidate Mike Huckabee even joked that he had cast several fraudulent ballots, including those of his dead parents and grandparents. Voter fraud is a felony in most states, including Arkansas. The truth is, voter fraud is easy to detect through signature matching and statistical analysis. And over the past 20 years, there have only been 143 convictions for voter fraud related to absentee ballots. That's less than 3 convictions per state over the last 2 decades. But that doesn't mean voting by mail is totally safe either. In the 2020 primaries, more than 500,000 absentee ballots went uncounted due to missed deadlines and submission mistakes. In the 2020 general election, experts expect even more rejected ballots. Every state has different requirements for mail-in voting. 16 states provide voters with a second secrecy envelope to tuck their ballot in. 4 of those states will reject any ballots that arrive with only 1 envelope. 7 states require mail-in ballots to be signed by a legal witness or approved by a notary. Only 20 states send out prepaid ballots, meaning voters in other states will have to pay for postage to vote. The Postal Service has confirmed that they will mail all ballots, even those with insufficient stamps. But that didn't stop some voters from sending their ballots back with 2 or even 3 stamps in response to misinformation on social media. Paranoia surrounding COVID-19 has only made things worse.
Sacramento County officials are asking people to stop disinfecting their mail-in ballots. The Registrar of Voters says that they have received at least 100 ballots damaged by disinfectant alcohol spray. And in one case, the registrar says that someone even microwaved their ballot in an attempt to get rid of any germs.
Sacramento County allowed those voters to resubmit their ballots, but many in the US may not have that luxury. By the time we go to air tonight, the voting phase of this election will be over. Now, we're entering the counting phase, and there are 3 things we can expect. First, this could take a while. Counting absentee ballots can be time-consuming, and many states weren't legally allowed to start the count until today. That means we may not know who the winner is for a few days, especially if Biden and Trump come close in a few key states. It's also possible that the electoral map we see tonight, based mainly on in-person polling, may look very different once mail-in votes are counted. 2, people might get sued. President Trump has prepared an army of attorneys to monitor and challenge vote counts across the country, and the Biden campaign has amassed its own force of more than 600 lawyers ready to hit back. If the election is tight, our next president may be chosen by the courts. 3, we're going to play the blame game. If Trump loses, he's likely to spend the last 2.5 months of his presidency accusing Democrats of voter fraud. And if Biden loses, many of his supporters will cast blame on rejected absentee ballots and voter suppression. And just like that, democracy strikes again. For NNN and Politicat, I'm Zach Miller.
The record number of votes cast by mail this year has led many states to adjust their deadlines for counting and receiving ballots. The time we get final vote counts in each state might be staggered as more mail-in ballots arrive.
And whether you're voting by mail or in person, early or on election day, you've probably given some thought to election security. For months now, that's been a major talking point, from the highest ranks of government to college classes and family dinners. But do you really know how officials are working behind the scenes to ensure a secure election? NNN's Simone Scott is here to show us.
With the pandemic setting the tone for this year's election, more Americans are voting by mail than ever before. Election officials are working to make sure this year's election is safe and secure.
The new person that we have here, every part-timer, doesn't realize what the Board of Elections really does and to what extent that we go to make sure that the voters vote is counted.
Poll workers and election officials from both parties work together to securely transport and tabulate ballots.
The precincts are actually extremely safe. I worked the polls myself in California back in the primary in March, and there is a whole system of processes that make sure that your ballot is safe brought to the counting office.
In Illinois, the Board of Elections recounts votes from 5% of the precincts to ensure accuracy.
There are very strict protocols in the Illinois Election Code for how those ballots are handled, how they are counted after the polls close. There are very strict rules for public observation of counting of ballots.
In Ohio, voting machines and equipment are securely stored in a locked room at the County Board of Elections. To gain access, both a Democrat and Republican must be present. Voting machines are kept offline in order to prevent cyber attacks.
When we talk about cybersecurity, and a lot of voters have a misunderstanding about this, we're not really talking about hacking into voting tabulators, to voting equipment and changing votes. That's not impossible, but the scenario for that to happen is so far-fetched that even cybersecurity experts don't see it as a prime target for hackers.
The real threat voters should be aware of is on social media.
In 2016, we saw, specifically from Russia, from the Internet Research Agency, creation of fake accounts on Facebook and Twitter. And they were fed to voters who were deemed to be the most able to be influenced.
A message to trust officials at the polls, but be wary as you scroll. Simone Scott, Northwestern News Network.
U.S. officials agree that it's highly unlikely foreign nations could affect casting or counting of ballots. They can, however, undermine the American people's confidence in the election. Be skeptical about what you read on social media and follow sources and people you trust.
And why are so many Americans voting by mail amid pandemic presidential election? Of course, there have been over 230,000 COVID-related deaths and over 9 million cases in the U.S., and COVID is affecting the election beyond physical voting ability. NNN's Lindsay Tanney explores how the coronavirus is impacting the vote.
The 2020 presidential election is like no other, as America hasn't voted in a pandemic since 1918. This puts issues like public health to the forefront of people's minds.
I think public health is always inescapably at some level political, but the science has been politicized more than usual. And so I think the uncertainty around the election is sort of feeding into the people's sort of own uncertainty about their health, economic questions and unemployment and so on.
According to a Pew Research poll, the top issues in this election for Trump supporters are the economy and violent crime, while Biden supporters' top issues are healthcare and the coronavirus outbreak.
Biden's focus on kind of how people are hurting and suffering, Trump's focus on kind of the economy, we have to reopen things and, get back to the best economy that we ever had sort of comments.
Differing attitudes also apply to voters as they decide how to safely cast their ballot.
It seems like a lot of people have tried to vote early to avoid, the potential for longer waits and more potential disease exposure on election day.
Now, polling places work to adapt to CDC guidelines to keep voters and poll workers safe.
Is that they want to keep the lines outside. They don't want to cluster everyone inside, which would be the way that under normal circumstances, if people were uncomfortable with kind of the political activities going on outside, you might be able to move everyone kind of inside and cluster them in a big room, but you don't want to do that during the pandemic.
How voters prefer to cast their ballots differs heavily between Trump and Biden supporters. A Pew Research Center poll says 80% of registered voters supporting Trump prefer to vote in person, whereas 58% of registered voters supporting Biden prefer to vote by mail. So what exactly does the risk of virus transmission look like at these polling sites?
I think they're doing a pretty good job, especially when you get a bunch of people that are, kind of constantly streaming in and out and everything like that. It's kind of hard to keep the social distancing really totally consistent, but they're doing a good job of it, especially when you get into the voting area.
Despite COVID precautions, people are hesitant to show up to the polls.
It appears that concerns about in-person voting are really driving some of the early voting and vote by mail.
Michael Chikowitz says he voted in person because he doesn't trust the Postal Service or the president.
I just don't trust him to do the right thing and, get the Postal Service running smoothly for this election.
Some people don't have a choice.
I personally didn't get my absentee ballot in time, so I had to come and switch my voter registration to Illinois to vote in person. So it might turn out in less people voting, but hopefully not.
Others play it safe.
I also voted by mail, and it was the first time that I've done so. I've always voted in person. There are simply people in public office who really aren't interested in making voting safe.
Do you think the pandemic is making it harder or easier for people to vote?
Well, I certainly think it's making it harder. It's making it more difficult. It's making it more dangerous. But I think people are also then confronting that with renewed determination to challenge these unfair and undemocratic measures and policies. So I don't necessarily think it will work, but it does expose everyone to greater risk.
Alan says when people look at what President Trump has done with the pandemic,
it seems as though more and more Americans are unsatisfied with his handling. But, there's always going to be, with President Trump, a kind of fiercely loyal base that, kind of defends him and supports him almost no matter what happens.
Time is ticking as we await the results of one of the most unconventional elections in history. Lindsay Tanney, Northwestern News Network.
Thanks, Lindsay. Uncertainty looms large on Wall Street during any election year, and 2020 is no exception. In fact, in a year like this, uncertainty might even be a bit of an understatement. Perhaps a better word, chaos. Stocks took a COVID-induced beating in March, resulting in one of the swiftest sell-offs in history. But what followed next was a massive tech rally, pushing the S&P 500 in September to an all-time high. That was 2 months ago, but in 2020, 2 months might as well be 2 years, with mounting COVID cases, a stalled stimulus package, and concerns surrounding the presidential election. Last week, the S&P dropped more than 5.5%.
Probably the majority of this pullback has been virus related. Probably a little bit stimulus, a little bit earnings. Might get, broader based lockdowns here in the US. Any one of those things in and of itself probably would not have caused the pullback we had. But you stack them on top of each other, and then getting back to where we started, you had what I think was pretty optimistic pricing in the market to begin with. And all of that together kind of causes a pullback.
But what's the best case scenario for the markets on election day? That's the million-dollar question. According to an analysis by US Bank, if one party takes the House, Senate, and White House, you might get some short-term volatility. A divided government, though, might actually be market-friendly. As for President Trump's opinion, well, take a listen.
If we win on Tuesday, or thank you very much, Supreme Court, shortly thereafter, if we win, let me tell you, if we win, you're going to see a stock market that's going to go like a rocket ship.
With the recent COVID resurgence, more economic turmoil might be unavoidable. No matter who wins the White House or controls Congress, nothing is certain.
U.S. economic data has started to slow and doesn't look as clean as it did over the summer. And I think for that reason, people are starting to get maybe a little more positive towards, I guess, what you call the blue wave. In terms of a Trump reelection, to me, that's the hardest one to sort of handicap here. That's a status quo outcome. So that probably means you have more of what we've had, which is underlying trade tensions, some business-friendly policies, maybe a smaller stimulus.
While a Trump re-election might be the status quo, more than 1,000 economists from across the country have said it would be bad news. They've signed an open letter urging the American people not to vote for Trump, saying, quote, he failed to achieve his campaign's core economic promises, how his personal behavior during the COVID-19 outbreak endangered public health, the economic recovery, and the safe reopening of schools, and that Donald Trump has rendered the United States unrecognizable. Dean Carlin was one of the 12 Northwestern faculty members who signed the letter.
The mere fact that Trump has done what he has done to our respect for institutions and is going to have long-lasting effects on other countries' ability to just trust us. And that's a problem. That's a problem we're all going to face.
One final question on the minds of many investors: what happens to the markets in the case of a contested election? There have only been 4 in all of American history, and only during 2000 did the major market indexes even exist. But don't expect to learn any lessons from Bush v. Gore. True, the markets did fall towards the end of 2000, but they were already inflated to begin with, enlarged mainly by worthless internet companies and what Alan Greenspan would describe as a rational exuberance. The dot-com bubble was beginning to burst. In a year so uncertain, nobody can tell you what tomorrow will bring. Just don't go saying that on Wall Street.
Thanks, Justin. And coming up, where do candidates stand on the issues from healthcare to climate change? Stay tuned.
At Northwestern, we're wildcats in every way.
Northwestern break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
This year, there's been a lot of discussion and media coverage of the candidates. You've probably heard someone say that they're voting for one candidate only because they can't stand the other.
But what about the issues? When this election is over, what policies will be enacted? What do the candidates, presidential, congressional, and local, actually stand for? We begin with law enforcement, an issue that hits close to campus this week. How have the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Walter Wallace Jr., and so many others shaped this election? How does the idea of law and order that emerges after calls to defund and abolish the police impact Black voters? Here's NNN's Elizabeth Betts.
Protesters flooding streets across America this summer.
demanding systemic change and condemning police brutality. And this election cycle, increased demands on the left to defund and abolish the police.
Basic knowledge would lead someone to understand that it has its footing in racism and white domination, and it's a way to bring back slaves, like literally bring them back to the plantation, to the prisons.
These demands reached the national stage. The candidates asked about their positions during the first presidential debate.
Are you in favor of law and order?
I'm in favor of law. You follow.
Are you in favor of law and order? Go
yes,
ahead.
I'm in favor. You asked a question. Let him finish. Law and order.
Law and order.
Let him. Law and order with justice, where people get treated fairly.
Both President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden say neither has any intention of abolishing the police if elected. Trump making law and order a major campaign talking point as the election looms closer. Tweeting calls for defunding and abolishing the police demonstrate that, quote, law and order, not defund and abolish the police. The radical left Democrats have gone crazy. According to his website, Biden, meanwhile, commits to strengthening America's commitment to justice and reforming its criminal justice system. For first-time voter Jahari Shelton, policing is one of the most important issues of this election.
I think that it first begins with actually naming it as a priority and naming that it is a problem.
Although it may seem like the calls to defund the police are widespread, according to a Pew Research Center poll released in June, 42% of Americans believe that in their area, police spending should stay about the same.
We have to move past the narrative about police brutality because it's almost ironic, right? Like, police are meant to be brutal. It is not an issue of police brutality, and that's why I think that we are not at the point yet where we have quite solved the problem. You have to make the choice between if you are investing in police or if you are policing as the total system, or if you are going to invest in community and care.
Though this issue impacts Black voters,
the responsibility cannot be put on those who suffer from law and order rhetoric to sort of solve it through entertaining the United States, like I want to say democracy, but more so plutocracy.
These demands to address policing in the United States continue to grow, and the next president can begin to address these concerns by listening to the people and compromising when necessary.
And Elizabeth joins us now. Elizabeth, what brings Black Americans to the polls?
Well, the tide certainly is changing with young Black voters who do not see a benefit in voting anymore, but certainly for older Black voters and therefore the Black community as a whole, there is still a benefit in voting.
And this week, Northwestern students have been protesting, calling for NU to divest from the NUPD. How does the American public feel about defunding or abolishing the police?
No, most Americans do not support the defund or abolish the police movement. Again, according to a poll released by the Pew Research Center in June, 42% of Americans say that in their area, police spending should stay about the same. Therefore, these Americans do not believe that there should be a defunding of police nor an abolishing.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Only 1 week after Election Day, the Supreme Court is set to hear oral arguments in California v. Texas in a major healthcare case. For more, we now turn to our chief congressional correspondent, Megan Leibowitz.
Thanks, Justin. The Supreme Court is hearing a case about whether the Affordable Care Act is still constitutional after in 2017 when a Republican-controlled Congress dropped the individual mandate penalty down to $0. The individual mandate penalty was the amount of money that you would pay if you did not buy health insurance. So why does this matter? Well, in 2012, the Supreme Court upheld the ACA by saying that the individual mandate penalty was a tax and therefore constitutional. So now, does a $0 tax mean a big problem for the future of the ACA? Over 20 million people gained health insurance since the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, went into effect. But now that might be in jeopardy.
We're in a good position now with the Affordable Care Act. If the Supreme Court strikes it down, if President Trump has his way, we're going to be in a tough period of transition here.
The ACA case comes just days after Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation to the highest court. But for Jan Schakowsky, congressional representative for Illinois' 9th District, which includes Evanston, the election might change the future of the ACA.
If Trump were to win, then all bets are off.
So how will the election impact the future of healthcare legislation? That may depend on which party controls Congress. If we see a President Biden and a Republican-controlled Senate, what can Democrats do realistically to make amendments to healthcare legislation and the ACA?
If it's, as you described, a Republican Senate and a Democratic president, very few changes will be made. There is general consensus, for example, in reducing the cost of prescription drugs. I think that is something that we may try to tackle on a bipartisan basis.
But not every Republican candidate says they'll oppose the ACA.
Because individuals, that my constituents like it, I'm going to defend it.
Another question, what do our current representatives think of expanding the Supreme Court for future healthcare cases? There's been a lot of conversation about should Democrats have control of Congress and the presidency after the election. Would Democrats consider adding additional Supreme Court justices in order to protect future healthcare legislation?
I agree with Joe Biden. I think the conversation about the future of the federal judiciary is long overdue. And it comes at a moment where we really need to do it carefully, because the Supreme Court as an institution now is under attack for being too partisan. And I think there's good reason for that attack.
Schakowsky says she thinks Congress should look at judicial reform,
which could include adding members to the court, but could also some of the what Biden has called for is a bipartisan commission to look at various options.
Although the new justice is sparking conversations about possible changes to the Supreme Court, that wouldn't come in time for the ACA case.
With the appointment of Justice Barrett, we are really nervous that they may break the ACA. If they break the ACA, we break our entire healthcare system.
The case hinges on whether the ACA is still constitutional after the individual mandate penalty was dropped to 0. And if it's not, does the entire act need to fall? Northwestern law professor Andrew Koppelman says not so fast.
Then it's argued that the entire statute somehow depends on this $0 penalty. So that if you strike down this $0 penalty, you also have to strike down the whole rest of the statute.
For Koppelman, the outcome may be clear-cut.
The arguments against Obamacare are so weak that I think it's entirely possible that the court will be unanimous in rejecting them.
The ACA has long attracted scorn from Republicans.
I think that's why, ultimately Obamacare was a move towards a single-payer system, which is, to me, would be very destructive.
For now, voters must wait for ballots to be counted to see what they can count on Congress to do with the future of healthcare policy.
And Megan is here with us now. Megan, how might the appointment of Justice Barrett influence the outcome of the ACA case?
So in 2012, the Supreme Court upheld the Affordable Care Act 5-4, with Chief Justice John Roberts joining the court's more liberal-leaning justices. But now one of those liberal justices, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, has been replaced by a more conservative Justice Amy Coney Barrett, while Trump's other two Supreme Court appointees, Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh, both replaced justices who voted against the ACA in that 2012 case. So Justice Barrett is really the key justice to be watching as we go into oral arguments for this case next week.
Is it a long shot to see the Senate flip blue, and how might that impact the future of healthcare?
There are 12 Senate Democrats and 21 Senate Republicans whose seats are on the ballot for the 2020 election. And right now in the Senate, there are 53 Republicans, 45 Democrats, and 2 independents. But those 2 independents caucus with the Democrats, so we'll have to see if Democrats are able to flip 4 seats in order to turn the Senate blue.
Thanks, Megan. Abortion is one of the social issues that's been a major talking point as of late, with the confirmation of a conservative to the Supreme Court just days before the election. Advocates fear women could lose the right to choose. However, it's about much more than choice for two advocates fighting for reproductive justice for Black women. Alexa McHale has the story.
We lost Roe v. Wade a long time ago. When you look at the reality of who really is not served by Roe v. Wade.
With the confirmation of conservative judge Amy Coney Barrett last week, Roe v. Wade, the 1973 landmark decision granting women the right to choose, could be in jeopardy as the election approaches. But for Marcia Jones at the Afia Center, the only reproductive justice organization in North Texas founded by Black women, the conversation extends miles beyond Roe.
Women's movement work that we're doing, Black women are dealing with many forms of oppression, even within this movement.
Their mission is to address reproductive health disparities for Black women and other marginalized women. Black women have more than double the unintended pregnancy rate of white women, according to the National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda.
There was this need for equal rights as it related to gender. But for Black women, it was equity as it related to gender, as it related to race, as it related to economics, class. Abortion have to be a part of a total health care conversation. You see this fight around the right to have an abortion, right? The right to have an abortion, but not the right to live.
While we think about what's going to happen to Roe, given the Supreme Court changes, given our election coming up, there's still, you're saying, so much more that needs to be done.
It means accessing that and all of the other necessary things that I need. It means making sure that I also get to have a child and not die, within the first year, or that child not die. So we have to expand the conversation. We've got to look at the economic status and statuses of Black women. We have to look at the conditions that Black women are living in. There's got to be housing that is accessible and that is also affordable.
Ashatia Campbell, a law graduate and policy and advocacy manager at Sister Love, a reproductive justice and HIV/AIDS awareness organization, also works to address reproductive health disparities for Black women. She is currently investigating racism in gynecology.
Mortality rate for Black mothers and Black newborns are higher than they would be for anybody else. And to, illustrate that Black women have a mistrust with the medical community, with things like forced hysterectomies being part of Black history.
How did Roe fall short for Black women, and what would you want to see happen in the future?
The pro-choice kind of stops with, the choice. We have to also consider what happens to the woman after the choice and what happens to the woman's family after the choice. So I am pro making your life better.
What could change in legislation that would address the needs of Black women?
What Roe really wanted. It wanted for women to have full bodily autonomy. And so I think we now have the opportunity to do that, right? We have the opportunity to really fight for what Roe could have been, what it was envisioned to be, but for all folk who need access to it.
Whoever wins the election, Campbell and Jones say their fight has just begun.
We have to celebrate what Black bodies look like and what women bodies look like. And so legislators have to hear from us, and legislators have to listen to us when we're speaking, and we have to be encouraged.
Fearful, we're not, right? Perseverance, resilience is just some of the words that come to mind when it comes to not just Black women, Black communities, and marginalized communities in general.
And I don't want people of privilege to leave. I want people to use their privilege to continue to open doors. I want people to continue to bring folk forward with them.
Campbell and Jones both fighting far beyond Roe. Alexa McHale, Northwestern News Network.
And the conversation doesn't stop with choice. Jones and Campbell also call for equity when it comes to maternity inequality, as well as economic, housing, and criminal justice disparities that unequally affect the Black community.
President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden have very different views in education. We hear a lot about higher education and affording college, but the candidates also have distinct platforms when it comes to lower schools. Here's NNN's Michaela Denault.
According to the Pew Research Center,
1 in 10 eligible voters in 2020 will be members of Gen Z.
And really want to make a difference now instead of waiting until they become the elected leaders. They actually want to make sure that the elected leaders are listening to them.
And as young people head to the polls, many are thinking about student debt and how the pandemic is affecting schools.
They're going to require even more funding, and their kids are definitely losing a lot of their chance to learn.
Focused on the election, the National Education Association supports policies that fix inequities laid bare during the pandemic.
Our students lack access to the resources and technology that they would need to do remote learning. And so we call that the digital divide homework gap.
This public school behind me relies on taxes to fund their educational programs and learning opportunities. However, Trump's Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, pushed the Education Freedom Plan, which diverted this money to private schools.
And so students, whether native or newcomer, Black or white, Latino or Asian, deserve what I had. All students deserve a high quality public education so that they will have the chance to be the citizens that we need them to be, and more importantly, the successes that they want to be.
Biden says he supports tuition-free public college for families that make less than $125,000 a year. Trump, meanwhile, prioritizes school choice in for-profit colleges, according to the National Education Association. Jim Reed of the Illinois Community College Trustees Association said the ICCTA advocates for equitable distributions of funding.
If we are not providing that funding, unfortunately, what will happen is that we find, and studies have shown, that students drop out of college. Oftentimes, they don't come back.
Biden's education plans heighten the federal overview of education. Vice President candidate Kamala Harris promotes policies to close the teacher pay gap and fund STEM programs at historically Black colleges. Trump's campaign seeks to diminish the government's role in public education by cutting relief packages to universities.
And that we really should be trying to do all we can to ensure that diversity, equity, inclusion are part of not only our curriculums for students, but also training for staff and faculty, and also the community at large.
Heading from the classrooms to the polls. Michaela Denault, Northwestern News Network.
Northwestern students, a part of NU Votes, encourage students and faculty to speak up about issues they are passionate about, such as education policy.
According to a Pew Research study, climate change ranks as the 11th most important issue to all 2020 voters. But scientists say this election is a critical juncture in combating climate change, and young voters plan to rewrite the story. I sit down with some young people on both sides of the aisle and speak exclusively to former presidential candidate Tom Steyer about the gravity of this election and the environment.
Climate change repeatedly deemed the story of our time. And time, scientists say, is of the essence.
Let me say this, it has to be the tipping point. This is not an optional decision.
Climate experts say this election is a critical crossroads in the fight to reverse climate change.
I think it's of paramount importance. We're at a kind of a precarious moment.
Tom Steyer couldn't agree more. The former Democratic candidate, founder of Next Gen America, and billionaire, now sits on the Biden campaign's Climate Engagement Advisory Council.
This is going to touch every part of this administration. I mean, it's going to touch, housing and transportation. It's going to touch commerce. It's going to touch the Secretary of State. This is, at some level, a global problem that requires a global solution, with America participating and leading.
Climate change is an issue that engulfs the nation. In the West, fires raging. In the South, hurricanes ravaging towns. Here in the Midwest, floods raising fields. For Northwestern student Nav Sakone, who hails from California, it hits close to home.
I think people really don't take into account how much climate change affects California. And it's just such an unreasonable thing to go back there and live there as it gets worse and worse.
This election, for the first time in history, there are just as many millennials and members of Gen Z eligible to vote as members of older generations. And young voters tell me they're prioritizing the planet as they head to the polls.
We're going to have to solve these problems. And seeing that so many kids actually care is what inspires me, that we will make progress and that we will achieve the goals that this planet needs.
For the first time in 12 years, questions about climate change taking center stage at presidential debates.
We're seeing a completely different sense of priority, importance, and urgency from the Democratic ticket to really address it.
But what about the Republican ticket? The candidates have vastly different climate platforms. President Trump rolling back some 160 environmental regulations over the past 4 years, while Biden says his plan sees a carbon-free energy sector by 2035.
And so that's a low carbon future or a high carbon future, essentially. And that's an incredibly important decision because essentially the argument boils down to any extra carbon that we add to the system will have a negative impact as we move forward.
It's an issue bigger than any administration, but climate action is often led by smaller grassroots organizations, like the local Chicago Youth Alliance for Climate Action.
It's frustrating because we have a lack of representation in Congress and our political offices. But seeing the amount of risk and the amount of passion that our generation has for it is really empowering in some sort of way.
And climate change isn't just a rallying cry for young Democrats. Young Republicans like David Groh understand the future is at stake.
Definitely feel like there's some sort of assumptions being made there that aren't fair. Because it's not that we disagree on whether or not climate change exists, it's just we disagree on how to go about it.
Of course, there are still climate change deniers, and like the coronavirus, discussions about climate change often plagued by misinformation.
As a scientist, it's always disappointing to see people saying things that just absolutely are not true.
Steyer energizing Americans to vote for clean energy. He says this election is key if the U.S. hopes to return to climate leader status.
Look, I don't think there's any substitute for winning the presidency. And no, we can't have a national Green New Deal with a president who will not accept the idea that we have a climate crisis we need to respond to.
Climate policy is also a hot-button issue in Senate and House races, and especially at a state level, as many states are dealing with climate emergencies firsthand. John Hickenlooper, for example, is running to unseat Republican incumbent Cory Gardner in Colorado. Hickenlooper champions climate action in his campaign. And the recent fires devastating parts of Colorado might really make his message resonate.
Great report, Joey. And coming up, what races should you be keeping an eye on? Stay tuned.
At Northwestern, we're wildcats in every way.
Cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
We mostly hear about the presidential election, but there are races all around the country that will determine the makeup of the government for at least the next 2 to 4 years. From Congress to state capitals, we want to make sure we're paying attention to the whole ballot. So let's start with the vice presidential candidates, Mike Pence and Kamala Harris, who are campaigning hard this election season. Does the vice president matter more this year than in elections past? Julia Richardson has more.
One of the many ways this election is unique? Both presidential candidates are well into their 70s.
I do think the vice presidents matter more, perhaps, than in other recent elections because of the age of the candidates. I think Kamala Harris was a great pick because she was, very highly vetted, so there were no surprises there, and she appeals to a wide range of the Democratic base and just voters generally.
Historically, vice presidents are selected to balance out a ticket. Maybe the presidential candidate is a moderate, so they pick a more progressive VP. or the candidate comes from the coast, so they pick a VP from the heartland.
You're talking about Republican voters. There are a lot of evangelical voters in the Republican base, so they, certainly see Pence as, a very devout, religious man who, appeals to them in that regard, I think, and that's been probably a strength to that ticket.
Steve Bolton, chairman of the Chicago Republican Party, agrees Pence makes the Republican ticket more balanced.
So Mike Pence certainly is much more of a Christian conservative type of person. So there is actually more of a balance between Donald Trump and Mike Pence within the Republican sphere, so to speak.
Bolton says balancing the ticket may be more important on the left.
The Democrats, I think that the balancing of Kamala Harris is much more important because of the fact that the Bernie Sanders wing has been so disappointed of late in the primaries that they've been unable to push forward a national candidate, and that the far more centrist Joe Biden ended up winning. So perhaps it's a lot more important within the Democratic Party to keep their coalition, so to speak, together, that Vice President Biden reached out to Senator Harris.
Maybe because the presidential candidates' ages, and the reminder that the presidents too are susceptible to the coronavirus, more people are paying attention to the VP candidates. Nearly 60 million Americans watch the VP debate on TV, making it the second most watched VP debate in TV history.
If President Trump is elected, Vice President Pence would then become the putative nominee in the 2024 elections. So he would instantly start to have a lot of attention within the Republican Party as the potential nominee. Whether that actually will happen or not is always an open question. If Vice President Biden wins and becomes President Biden, I think the same would possibly be true for Vice President Harris, though I think that given the fact that she's on the far left of the Democratic Party, she might be a lot more wide open to challenge within the party.
If Biden wins, and I believe he will, I believe that she becomes the front runner for 4 years from now. As for Pence, I'm not sure, because I think there's going to be a real reckoning with what happened in these 4 years of Trump, assuming Biden wins. So considering that Pence was Trump's VP, that may be a big negative for him.
Harris and Pence vying to be second in command. Julia Richardson, Northwestern News Network.
Kamala Harris and Mike Pence are advocating for opposite agendas. Harris's top priorities are climate change and affordable health care. She supports a Green New Deal and says she will always offer her, quote, lived experience to Biden as policy is crafted. Pence continues to prioritize the economy and national security. He's a vocal supporter of sending children back to in-classroom learning.
Tonight, Democrats aren't just hoping to take back the White House. The Senate is also up for grabs, and Republicans are at risk of losing their majority. Who's most vulnerable, and how have they been campaigning? To answer those questions, here's NNN's Zach Kessel.
Thanks, Justin. Though the weather is getting colder, Senate Republicans are feeling the heat. While President Donald Trump trails former Vice President Joe Biden in the polls by a significant margin, 538's Senate forecast gives the GOP a slim chance of retaining its Senate majority. With their prospects growing more dismal by the day, some Senate Republicans have distanced themselves from the president. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has taken informal shots at the president in recent weeks, telling the Washington Post on October 8th that he had not been to the White House since August 6th because the White House would not enforce mask wearing and social distancing. According to the Daily Beast, McConnell told GOP donors to contribute to his Senate leadership fund rather than the Trump campaign, a tacit acknowledgement of the possibility that the president brings the GOP Senate majority down with him. Another senator to keep an eye on? Texas Republican John Cornyn. In October, Cornyn told the Fort Worth Star-Telegram that he has privately disagreed with President Trump on issues including the national debt, tariffs, and immigration. He described his relationship with the president as being, quote, maybe like a lot of women who get married and think they're going to change their spouse, and that doesn't usually work out very well. But publicly opposing the president can have consequences. Maine's Republican Senator Susan Collins recently substantiated weeks of speculation by voting against Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation. President Trump retaliated via his favorite medium, tweeting his displeasure with the numerous times she's opposed him during his presidency. Now, 538's Senate forecast gives Collins just a 38% chance of holding off challenger Sarah Gideon. One senator in a safer race has more leeway to criticize the president. During a recent town hall, Nebraska's Republican Senator Ben Sasse said that the president, quote, kisses dictators' butts and has flirted with white supremacists. Sasse is projected to win his Senate race by a wide margin, which gives him more latitude to criticize the president than someone like Susan Collins. Senator Collins must walk the line between alienating moderate Maine voters by tacking too far to the right and angering the Republican base by rebuffing the president. On one hand, senators like Collins or Cory Gardner in Colorado risk losing their seats in an anti-Trump wave, and on the other, they risk depressing Republican turnout. It's a tough needle to thread, and chances are the Republicans become the minority party in the Senate for the first time since the 2014 midterm elections. For Northwestern News Network, I'm Zach Kessel.
Thanks, Zach. There are 35 Senate seats up for grabs tonight, 23 of which are currently held by Republicans.
The results of the presidential election rely heavily on the voters in swing states. One key state that could decide this election is Florida. Let's check in with NNN's Gabrielle Coriati in Boca Raton. Gabrielle, why is Florida such a key state in the Electoral College system?
Thanks, Joey. Now, Florida is one of the key swing states with a significant number of electoral votes that both candidates have been spending a lot of time and resources focusing on in the last several weeks. President Obama won the state in 2008 and 2012, while President Trump snagged a victory in 2016 by just over 1% of the total votes. Now, according to a recent 538 article, if Biden wins Florida, he has a 99% chance of winning the Electoral College as a whole. His chances diminish significantly if President Trump wins the state.
And there's a history in Florida of issues with counting the votes. What safeguards are in place to make sure everyone's vote is counted this year?
So Florida has a history beyond the year 2000 of having issues with the elections. In 2016, there was a Russian hack into counties' election systems, and in 2018, approximately 3,000 votes went missing during a statewide recount. Now, there have been safeguards in place to prevent this from happening this year in 2020, with certain counties being required to save digital ballot images. However, 2020 is still off to a little bit of a rough start in Florida, with the system for voter registration crashing on the last day to register. Now here's to hoping for a hiccup-free rest of the election. Back to you.
Thanks, Gabby. Now another key swing state, let's check in with Simone Scott in Ohio.
In the past 14 presidential elections, the candidate who has won Ohio has also won nationally, so it'll be interesting to see if that trend continues. Now, throughout this entire race, Trump and Biden have been neck and neck in the polls, but more recent polls have Biden ahead by as many as 5 points. Now, at this same point in the 2016 election, polls had Trump ahead by 2 points. He ultimately prevailed in Ohio by over 8 points. Polls also say this year that the number one issue Ohioans are concerned about is COVID-19, followed by healthcare and the economy.
Thanks, Simone. We really haven't heard much about third-party candidates this year, but if you've already cast your vote, you'll know that third-party candidates fill out the ballot. Who are they, and are people voting for them? NNN's Julia McCary reports.
Third-party candidates amassed almost 5% of the popular vote in 2016. In critical swing states Michigan and Wisconsin, third-party candidates took 6% of the popular vote. Will this year be different?
This is not the election to vote for a third party.
How do third parties function in the United States?
Third parties don't exist in the same way in the United States as they do in multi-party systems such as like Germany or the Ukraine, where third parties or parties outside of a two-party system have just as equal of an opportunity as winning in general, where that doesn't exist in the United States.
That is not to say third-party candidates are never successful, but the U.S. is reliably a two-party system.
As third parties come up, like for example, the Republican Party was seen as a third party that replaced the Whigs. But in what I just said, it replaced a party, so two parties still continued that was a sustained system. And I don't see parties such as the Tea Party and the Green Party being powerful enough in terms of voter support and even monetary economic support where they would be able to push out either the Democrat or Republican parties.
In this election, the major third-party candidates are Joe Jorgensen of the Libertarian Party and Howie Hawkins of the Green Party. California voters might recognize well-known music artist Kanye West on the ballot as a VP candidate for the American Independent Party. Jo Jorgensen is running on a platform including the legalization of marijuana, ending bailouts for big corporations, healthcare reform, and decreasing the national debt. Howie Hawkins is
pushing for free college and the Green New Deal to ban fracking, like all of these more progressive things that are more aligned with my views and personality and just like the way I live my life.
Northwestern student Kate Bowman said she voted for Howie Hawkins, the Green Party candidate, because he aligned more with her personal views.
So I'm in the Green Party. I think that it reflects my views better than any other party. Like pushing for universal health care, which is really important to me because I'm immunosuppressed.
Voting third party is her way of using her voice to reform the two-party system.
The entire purpose of a democracy is to vote for what you believe in. So if you're saying, well, I'm voting, because this person's less bad, like how is that a democracy at all? It's actually proven that when a democracy is in decline, voters vote along party lines instead of along actual interests.
Bowman says she voted Green because she is confident her home state, California, will vote blue regardless of her vote. But if she were from a swing state, she may have voted differently.
If I was in Florida or Pennsylvania or like any swing state, just given what's going on right now, yeah, I would vote blue.
Third-party voters working to make their voices heard. Julia McCary, Northwestern News Network.
Thanks, Julia. In Texas, Senate incumbent John Cornyn is being challenged by Air Force vet MJ Hager. For more on that race, our own Fred Tippett sat down with Hager's communications director. Take a look.
I am Amanda Sherman Beatty. I am MJ Hager, candidate for U.S. Senate in Texas, communications director. We're really excited. I mean, we've seen Texas kind of be that thing everyone chases, especially Democrats chase for multiple cycles now. We're feeling really confident and really excited. It's time for Texas to get its due.
So what do you think has brought Texas sort of within the Democrats' reach within the past few years?
I think it's candidates like MJ and failing senators like John Cornyn. MJ is a decorated combat vet, working mom, someone who is raising her kids in Texas, been raised in Texas. She understands the challenges facing Texans. So just time and time again, I think you're seeing this frustration, this excitement for someone who actually understands them and will get things done.
So you think it's just the amount of time that John Cornyn has been in office and the little that he's done that's sort of shifting people away from him?
I think it's people realizing, one, it's people being very dissatisfied with what they're seeing from Washington across the board, what they're seeing, what they're able to get done.
Is that frustration sort of the primary emotion that you're seeing, or is there something else that's motivating them?
I would say in Texas, there's primarily a why can't our elected officials do better? It's a lot of people knowing common sense of what needs to be done and a lot of frustration with like, why can our government not get their act together? Why can't they do this?
If MJ is to win next Tuesday, what does she hope to achieve?
I think absolutely. So I think the biggest issues top of mind for her, obviously federally relief for the COVID-19 pandemic. We need PPE, we need access to testing, we need expanded unemployment, as well as kind of finally getting a healthcare system. For too long, we've just watched as the Affordable Care Act has been torn down. It's time to get access for affordable healthcare to Texans.
MJ's a vet. She was a helicopter pilot, correct?
She's a combat search and rescue and medevac pilot. So she was, Air National Guard and served 3 tours in Afghanistan.
How does that sort of contribute to her vision for Texas, her political vision, and her general outlook?
It makes her much more of a servant leader. She's someone who is used to putting the mission first, is sitting at a mission planning table with people you don't agree with, people you may hate, that you completely don't respect, but at the end of the day, they're on your team for the mission, and you have to put anything else aside. And I think that's really why she's in this race, is like many Texans, she saw that there are very serious challenges facing our communities, but no one who's willing to put aside the partisanship, at least in Texas from our senators, and actually get things done. She's very effective driven, because as she would say, you would go out on a mission and you can't plan the next mission based on your last mission. You have to go back and look at ways you can improve, look at things you can do. But the next mission is, if you take a lesson from the last, you take the lesson. But if you treat the next mission like the last mission, you're guaranteed not to come home.
How much does the last mission of Beto O'Rourke's campaign in 2018, how much does that affect MJ's run this year?
I mean, I think he did great things. MJ was actually on the ballot with him when she was running for Congress in 2018. I don't think there's any question about that. He got people excited. He got voters thinking it's possible. We've definitely built on that. But at the end of the day, MJ's not, Beto and Ted Cruz and John Cornyn are not the same people either. In Texas, the polls were totally wrong in 2018. This is an electorate. The highest number of people we had voting prior to this was, I think, somewhere around 9 million-ish. We had 8 million vote in 2018. Right now, there are estimates that between 10 and 12 million Texans will vote in this election. And it is very hard in a state that's changing as rapidly and new voters are registering as fast, to kind of figure out what that means and to see what that looks like. And there's going to be a lot of huntification and there's a ton of new Texas experts. It's so new into what it's going to look like. It's so evolving that we'll see there's a lot you can predict, but there's a lot that we're just going to find out on election night. If anyone tells you they have a really good sense of who's voting right now in Texas and what that exact electorate looks like, they're not giving you the full truth. I don't think anyone, even pollsters, would say we really know what this is going to look like, because it's unprecedented.
It'll be a tough road to victory for Hager, who currently trails by more than 5 points in many polls.
It's one of the great lessons learned from 2016. Many of the prominent polls got it wrong. That's not without exception, but major polls from 538 and the New York Times had Hillary Clinton pegged to win. This year, voters are skeptical of the polls, but there's a lot we can still glean from them. NNN's Vanessa Kelson explains.
In the 1930s, polling response rates were above 90%. Today, they're in the single digits.
Go into the polls and watch very carefully.
Why this drastic decrease? Northwestern professor Chloe Thurston says it's because landlines are well on their way to obsolete.
The way that many of these polls worked historically was that they would do something called random digit dialing of landlines, and that's how they could sort of ensure they have a random sample of voters. It's nice because the landlines are geographically based. And so it was great in a certain era, and it's much more problematic now.
Over 50% of U.S. households don't have a landline today, and random digit dialing for cell phones is banned in the U.S.
People are also leading more active lives. They're more likely to be out of the house.
So if no one is responding, where are pollsters getting their numbers?
It has to do with the application of statistical methods. Some of it results in what we call non-response weighting, comparing the characteristics of the people who responded to what we think are the characteristics of the people who didn't respond. And that's why we get this kind of modeled result rather than the simple aggregation.
In 2016, many polls anticipated a comfortable win for Hillary Clinton. That didn't happen, but those polls weren't entirely wrong. They did predict the popular vote.
National poll estimates of the popular vote were quite accurate, about as accurate as they've ever been. The state level estimates in many important states were statistically biased against Donald Trump.
So why did the states get it wrong?
Pre-election pollsters face a number of problems in doing their work. It begins with the fact that only a little bit more than half of Americans who are eligible actually go to vote. So they have to model what they call the likely electorate.
And this is where 2016 gets tricky.
The basic assumptions they often start with is that the electorate this time will look like the electorate last time. But 2016 had a couple of distinguishing features that were quite different from 2012.
What were those distinguishing features? For one, turnout in urban areas was down, which typically have more Democratic voters. Plus, there was an increase in college-educated people voting for Democrats, and an increase in people without a degree voting red. Now, in 2020, polls are being made with these changes in mind.
We think that the pollsters learned from that and have adjusted their weighting procedures and to some extent their sampling procedures for 2020.
The director of Suffolk University Political Research Center says COVID-19 has affected these procedures.
Response rates actually improved because of COVID-19. I think that's because people were just cooped up in their houses. They were miserable talking to the people in their own houses, and they wanted to talk to some fresh new voice, I suppose.
This cycle of learning isn't new for pollsters, Thurston says.
We think about historically some of the really important advances in polling. They kind of happen after there's a controversy about a really poorly done but popular poll.
And history repeats itself.
A really prominent example of this, before the birth of modern polling in sort of the 1930s, people would go to this magazine called Literary Digest for election prediction. And the Literary Digest did a great job. They're very accurate in predicting election outcomes.
But in 1936, they failed to predict FDR's win.
Not everyone has a phone in the 1920s and 1930s. I think might skew towards a certain part of the population.
Literary Digest oversampled wealthier populations, so their likely electorate was wrong. Similar to 2016, the Digest lost their credibility, but it wasn't all bad.
So out of that came, some soul searching, but also much more hunger for, sort of a more scientific basis for polling.
Failures turned lessons. The future of polling is right around the corner. Vanessa Kelson, Northwestern News Network.
It's a really interesting look at how history can and does repeat itself. Thanks, Vanessa. And coming up, we'll visit the voters, so stick around.
At Northwestern, we're wildcats in every way.
Northwestern break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all the go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
The country is as polarized as we've seen in our lifetimes, but not everyone identifies as a Democrat or Republican. We want to introduce you to some voters from around the nation who don't fit into the two-party mold. We'll start with a look at those who, as of Monday, are undecided. Here's NNN's Chloe Cope.
As Election Day nears, the clock is ticking for undecided first-time voters to make up their minds.
This sounds harsh, but the hatred around people instead of parties.
Unaffiliated voter Kenzie Friedman cast her first ballot in a presidential election a week ago and says it's about more than just politics.
And it's more than just the party and what their party stands for, but also the person and whether I think they're fit to run our country and who I want to be the face of our country.
Climate change, the swift confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the age of the candidates also impacted her vote.
Because the candidates are so old, I also looked a lot at the vice president candidates, understanding that if something was to happen, especially in the middle of a pandemic, if something goes wrong, who's the person that I want as the backup to the face of our country?
Friedman says she feels her college campus's liberal environment makes it difficult to share some of her more conservative views.
There's a lot of people who are very, very, very liberal. And there's only a very small number of people that I feel comfortable discussing politics around, just because I know that because I have more conservative ideas, I'm typically the minority on a college campus.
Professor and author Ellen Shearer says this uncertainty and external pressure can cause people to simply not vote because they don't want to choose wrong.
That's one of the reasons people don't vote, that they are of making the wrong choice, whatever wrong is.
But Shearer says this is no excuse not to vote.
But I would just say it's always better to cast your ballot and use your power.
And Friedman is glad that she did.
If you don't vote, I feel like then you can complain about politics because you didn't do your job. So how do you expect them to know what you want if you didn't express your opinion?
While it's hard to predict exactly who or what will determine the course of this election, Shearer says one thing is for sure. It will be a battle, so cast your ballot. Chloe Cope, Northwestern News Network.
Thanks, Chloe. President Trump's rhetoric and policies are uniting Democrats who seek to win back the White House while polarizing and dividing the Republican Party. As Trump campaigns for a second term, the whole party is not behind him. Here's NNN's Katrina Pham.
Although Trump figureheads the Republican Party, not every Republican supports him.
I think I'm more Republican than Donald Trump is.
Mets did not support Trump in the 2016 election, and after Trump's presidency, others feel the same. Groups like the Lincoln Project and 43 alumni for Joe Biden have been forming to oppose a second term for the incumbent president.
What we're seeing is a significant split within the Republican Party. You have, particularly on the right and especially on the far right, you have an awful lot of Trump supporters who are dug in.
Professor Peter Slevin says that the Republican Party is headed towards a reckoning. Data from the Pew Research Center shows that although a majority of voters have remained within their party, white voters without a college education have tended to lean more Republican, whereas all major non-white racial and ethnic groups have tended to lean more Democratic.
Young voters seem less attracted to the party. They certainly do very poorly among Black Americans, and they're losing, although not by as significant a margin, among Latino voters.
Voter demographics show a 14% decrease in non-Hispanic white voters from 84% of eligible voters in 1992 to 70% of eligible voters in 2016. Now, the Republican Party faces a split between Trump supporters and those who don't believe he represents the party.
Trump really actually caused a huge shift in the Republican Party towards big government, as opposed to in the past, traditionally, we've been the party of small government.
What else causes the rift? Connor Metz from Republican Voters Against Trump points to immigration policies, foreign relations, social media, and more.
Anyone who follows Trump on Twitter, who goes to his rallies, recognizes that his passion is for white voters. And that can only hurt him with some of the voters that the Republican Party most needs if it's going to develop a real vibrant future.
As the Republican Party's base group of white Americans is making up less of the voting class, the grand old party may stay at that. Old. Katrina Pham, Northwestern News Network.
Thanks, Katrina. We'll see if Trump's downplay of the recent COVID resurgence will alienate some within his own party.
Suburban voters make up a key demographic for the presidential race in several swing states. How have the candidates made their pitch? Jason Harward has the story.
I let you have the American dream. I wiped out a regulation that will destroy the suburbs. You know that? Would you like a nice low-income housing project next to your suburban, beautiful ranch-style house?
As Donald Trump fights for the presidency, he has his eye on the suburbs. His claims of defending suburbia from crime and affordable housing often appear in his speeches and tweets, where he refers to the, quote, suburban lifestyle dream as under threat from Democrats.
I think Donald Trump's message is actually about saving white women from people of color, right? And that message is actually as old as time, and it is aimed at white men. That is a dog whistle that is actually a foghorn, right? He's talking about race.
Trump is a key part of developing this narrative of suburbia in peril. He helped launch the McCloskey couple into infamy as an example of law-abiding citizens under attack. The previously unknown McCloskeys spoke at the RNC, falsely accusing Democrats of looking to destroy the suburbs.
They want to abolish the suburbs altogether by ending single-family home zoning. This forced rezoning would bring crime, lawlessness, and low-quality apartments into now thriving suburban neighborhoods. Your family will not be safe in the radical Democrats' America.
Single-family zoning is one way suburbs can, if they want to, remain largely racially and economically segregated. Dr. Bill Fischel, an expert on zoning practices, says much of the political atmosphere around suburbs stems from the importance of home value in the modern economy.
So a single-family home is a very top-heavy asset. And for many people, it's the biggest asset that they have. Some people, it's really the only asset that they have. And so they're really touchy about things that would reduce its value.
Sebastian Knowles, a mayoral candidate here in Evanston, said he thinks raising property values starts with investment into communities. This principle underlies some of Joe Biden's housing platform, which calls for $100 billion in housing investment, as well as the return of some Obama-era housing regulation.
We see that there are many wards here in Evanston that have been historically redlined. And those are wards that see an increase in crime and see a decrease in economic opportunities. In order to raise property value, you have to invest into neighborhoods.
One state where suburban voters make up a key demographic is Pennsylvania, a must-win for both candidates. Organizers tell me the southeastern triangle of Dauphin, York, and Lancaster counties, west of Philadelphia, as well as Beaver County, north of Pittsburgh, are major bellwethers for the state. Any large departure from the 2016 vote totals these counties put up would be a critical development in the 2020 race.
That is a place where there have been increasing Latinx population, but also increasing participation among disaffected voters, right? So people who didn't vote in 2016.
Both candidates courting the same suburban voter. Tonight, only one rose. Jason Harward, Northwestern News Network.
Trump's 2016 victory in the Rust Belt states shows working-class voters are leaning more red. As COVID-19 takes a toll on our country, Trump's stronghold may be at risk. NNN's Samara Lippman has the story.
In the Rust Belt, drastic economic and industrial changes in the past 50 years have resulted in changes to the political makeup of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. After going blue in 2008 and 2012, the Rust Belt swung red in 2016.
Expectation that Obama voters, Black Obama voters in particular, would easily transition into voting for Clinton because she was running against a racist. That vote did not materialize. So what you actually see is the working class, not the white or the black, but the working class of the upper Midwest revolting against the Democratic Party, but they just do so in different ways.
In what used to be America's heartland of industrialization, working class voters in the Rust Belt are left behind by American economic policy as foreign trade deals remain unstable and work continues to move abroad.
So what do these places have in common? I mean, they're places that really had they had a good life for a while, right? These were jobs, and they weren't like I wouldn't. A lot of people wouldn't say they're fulfilling jobs, right? Like working on an assembly line is not necessarily a fulfilling job, but paid a good salary. You could have a good life. Your kids could have a good life.
After decades of foreclosure waves, unemployment, and housing losses, working class voters in the Rust Belt feel forgotten by the Democratic Party.
A lot of people around here who might agree with Democratic ideals feel largely abandoned by the Democratic Party.
This Republican move in the Rust Belt shifts the U.S. electoral map, making it even more important for candidates to secure the region.
West Virginia was the most pro-Democratic state in the country. Now it is the second most pro-Republican state in the country. And that transition happened in less than 20 years. It happened in 16 years. And I sort of see that West Virginia move as an extreme case of what's happening in similar counties in other Rust Belt states.
Current polling numbers have Biden and Trump head-to-head across the Rust Belt. Whether the Republican shift of 2016 will stick We do not know. But working class voters across the region are looking to their unions and communities to make their presidential choice.
It also means, for me personally, voting for workers' rights and in favor of union labor.
In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, the president may face an uphill battle in the Rust Belt.
Safe to say that COVID is a pretty, Trump and Republicans can downplay it all they want, but I think it's probably a pretty large economic and social crisis that people feel on sort of an intuitive day-to-day level. So the research would suggest that the party in power will pay a pretty heavy price for that, no matter what they say.
Trump will have to win, and win big, if he wants to take the Rust Belt this election.
If Trump doesn't in these counties, doesn't win them by like double digits, he needs to win them by like 10, 11, 12, 13, maybe 15 points even. If he doesn't do that, I don't think he can win. So that the fact that he is even in those counties, in those middle suburb counties, suggests to me that there's been some erosion there.
Whichever way the election goes, working class voters are calling for a change in our national politics, hoping for a more accessible future.
If any group or politician wants to get the working class vote around here, they have to actually engage in conversation with working class people.
Rust Belt guaranteed Trump the 2016 election. Time will only tell if he's able to do it again. Samara Lippman, Northwestern News Network.
Thanks, Samara. And now a story that might resonate, especially with our student viewers. Memes are making headlines this election season. From the Mike Pence fly to Bernie Sanders once again asking, humor is helping get people to the polls. And NNN's Lauren Hutner has more.
The 2020 election will be quite meme-erable.
I've really liked Kamala's faces.
This is the woman behind Yeet Cory Gardner, an Instagram account playing a large role in the Colorado Senate election between Republican Cory Gardner and Democrat John Hickenlooper. She asked NNN not to publish her name to protect her personal accounts.
And I was like, man, Cory Gardner's the worst. Like, I bet he goes to Casa Bonita for the food. And that was kind of where it all began.
Her account has over 19,000 followers, and Yeet says she's already seen the impact of her posts.
The people it's reaching it's 75% between the ages of 18 and 34, which is the demographic that doesn't show up to vote.
Gen Z sees the memes. Zay Dowdu frequently posts political content to her Instagram stories.
What kind of Gen Z doesn't love a good meme?
She finds them easy to understand.
They're pretty straightforward, especially since they only have 2 lines of text and a picture.
Meme creators are working to make politics digestible for young audiences.
I think by putting something as important as an election into a meme format, or kind of these bite-sized moments, you really kind of get to access people who probably wouldn't be reached by traditional political advertising.
So should all political campaigns use memes? Yeet says not necessarily.
What makes this different than Mike Bloomberg paying all these really huge meme accounts to post about him and his failed presidential campaign was that this is organic. It spread from people's genuine interest and not just someone throwing a bunch of money at it.
John Hickenlooper has found Yeet's account and used it to create a political ad.
And let's yeet Cory Gardner.
Yeet isn't the only one creating memes. Accounts have popped up to poke fun at Martha McSally, Tom Tillis, and Steve Daines. Some of these accounts have more followers than the actual candidates.
So there are a whole bunch. We kind of accidentally franchised this.
Social media users using humor to encourage civic engagement. Lauren Hutner, Northwestern News Network.
And Lauren joins us now. Lauren, what's inspiring youth voters to cast a ballot in this election?
Well, something we're seeing play a large role in encouraging the youth vote is social media. Brands and influencers are using platforms like Instagram and TikTok to encourage young voters to cast their ballots. From Urban Outfitters' I'm a Voter campaign to David Dobrik giving away free Teslas in exchange for people registering to vote. We're finally seeing the intersection between politics and internet culture, ultimately meeting the needs of Generation Z.
Thanks, Lauren. And after the break, we'll bring it home with a last look at local races.
At Northwestern, we're wildcats in every way.
Northwestern break right through that with our colors flying. We will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
At Northwestern University, we are pioneering innovation and achieving excellence across every imaginable discipline. At Northwestern University, the possibilities are endless.
Welcome back. Let's bring it home. Washington can seem like a world away, but our local government tangibly impacts our lives every single day. What are local candidates and Illinois representatives promising in this election? What are the issues that matter here in the land of Lincoln? Let's welcome back Chief Congressional Correspondent Megan Leibowitz. Megan, Evanstonians are voting for 2 congressional representatives on the ballot, 1 Senate seat and 1 House seat. Let's start with the Senate. Senator Dick Durbin, the Senate Democratic whip, faces off against Republican Mark Curran.
Thanks, Joey. Incumbent Dick Durbin has been a senator of Illinois for 23 years, and he has a leadership position as the Democratic whip. I spoke with Senator Durbin about what his healthcare priorities would be if he is reelected, and The Economist predicts he is all but certain to hold his seat. What are your top healthcare priorities in terms of amending the Affordable Care Act or passing additional healthcare legislation during one of the biggest health crises that the country has faced in a century?
Well, this pandemic, this public health crisis is the top priority. Getting it under control, doing it the right way, breaking the back of this virus, as some countries have done. Secondly, I think part of this is discussing the future of the Affordable Care Act. I lived through it. I watched it. I was in a whip in the Senate when it was put together. I know all of the twists and turns that took place, and I voted for it proudly and believe it's one of the best votes ever cast. But it is not perfect.
Considering we don't know what the long-term impacts of COVID-19 are, if more people are going to have to seek long-term medical care because of pre-existing conditions, we simply don't know because it's such a new disease. How does that impact the conversations that you are having with your Democratic colleagues in the Senate about the future of the Affordable Care Act and heading into this campaign? Or the election?
People with coronavirus, positive COVID-19, have a pre-existing condition now. And we've got to make sure, I believe, that any insurance plan that we come up with gives them protection. What we need is a much larger pool of people paying premiums for this to work so we can keep the premiums low.
What sorts of specific conversations are you having with the other members of leadership about how to move forward past a roadblock?
I think the first question I have to ask, and we don't know the answer to, is what does the Senate look like after November 3rd? Currently, it's 53 Republicans, 47 Democrats. Mitch McConnell, as the Republican majority leader, literally controls what will come to the floor of the Senate. It'll be his agenda. If it switches, if it's now Chuck Schumer as a Democratic leader who's in charge of the majority of the Senate, it's a much more open conversation on this issue, on the Affordable Care. I might say that we are still burdened with the 60 vote requirement.
Durbin's challenger Mark Curran has a law enforcement background and previously served as a Lake County sheriff. I spoke with him about how he would lead through a pandemic. If you are elected to the Senate, what restrictions would you recommend be put in place for COVID-19 in Illinois, or what restrictions would you like to see lifted in Illinois?
Well, it's all a balance. We want to make sure that people are kept safe. There's a vulnerable population that we need to make sure that they're able to be kept safe. But as I said before, the governor's now talking about more lockdowns. We're the only state around that has lockdowns on this level. We're the only state that has had a long history of being very unfriendly to business.
What's your view on a mask mandate?
I have no problems with mask in a state by state. Mask mandate is fine. There's no authority, I think, to do that under the U.S. Constitution. In addition to having been a longtime lawyer, I was a constitutional law professor. So you have the 10th Amendment reserve clause. Those powers not expressly stated in the Constitution are reserved for the states. Goes on to talk about health care, health, welfare, safety, that those are amongst those powers that are reserved for the states.
So what do the candidates have in common? Durbin and Curran told me that they are both in favor of protecting medical insurance for people with pre-existing conditions. They are also both in favor of allowing adult children to stay on their parents' health insurance plans until age 26, which is currently mandated by the ACA for insurance plans that offer dependent child coverage. Joey and Justin.
All right, thanks, Megan. We'll check back in with you soon.
The expensive and contentious battle over Illinois' proposed tax amendment comes to a close today as voters go to the polls. NNN's Talia Kallman has the story.
On the ballot today in Illinois is a constitutional amendment that would switch the state from a flat income tax to a graduated income tax. The Illinois General Assembly adopted a law in June of 2019 that would impose different tax brackets if the constitutional amendment passes. The new rates would cut taxes to people making less than $100,000 a year, while those making more than $250,000 a year will see a tax hike. Vote Yes for Fairness, a campaign funded heavily by Governor Pritzker's personal fortune, insists the amendment is critical to fixing the current tax system, which they say is broken.
We believe that that's fundamentally unfair. It burdens our middle and lower income families. It allows the wealthiest people in the state to get away with not paying their fair share.
Opponents of the amendment, like the Illinois Policy Institute, a nonprofit think tank, argue the graduated tax structure will not solve Illinois' problems.
It would actually make them worse. This does not solve the structural deficit, and therefore it's quite likely that Illinois will fall to junk-level credit rating, even with the progressive tax, and that future tax increases will be coming down the road.
With Illinois' fiscal and budget crisis only worsening, proponents argue this amendment is the best option the state has now.
We could either pass the fair tax, they'll have to raise rates on everyone, or they'll have to make major spending cuts, and those spending cuts will come from things like healthcare or education.
But opponents worry that putting more money into a flawed system won't fix it and might force Illinois' politicians to raise taxes on the middle class.
Asking struggling taxpayers to pay more for decades now, our net debt, the net debt of Illinois, has quadrupled over the same 10-year period that we started hiking income taxes. So the progressive income tax is not something that will make our fiscal situation better. It's doubling down on the same failed strategy that left us in this position to begin with.
The constitutional amendment can be ratified either if 60% of voters vote yes on the question, or if a simple majority of all voters, including those who skip the question, approve it. If passed, the new tax structure will take effect January 1st, 2021.
Pass or fail, this constitutional amendment is the most expensive ballot initiative in Illinois' history, with total contributions nearing $100 million.
And it doesn't get any closer to home for NU students than Illinois' 9th District. Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky represents Evanston in the House of Representatives, and she's up for re-election. To break down her race, we turn back to our chief congressional correspondent, Megan Leibowitz. Megan?
Jan Schakowsky is in her 11th term in Congress. This year she faces off against Republican Sargis Sangari, who previously ran for the 9th District seat in 2018, but did not win the Republican primary. I spoke with both candidates about how they would lead the 9th District through the pandemic.
I think that healthcare is clearly, because of COVID and because so many people who have lost their jobs have also lost their health care, will be front and center on the agenda.
Now, Schakowsky is looking toward the future of healthcare in the U.S. as Illinois sees a surge in coronavirus cases.
The new president, if it's President Biden, is talking about the maintaining the ACA. We would have the votes, I assume, for that. Again, assuming that we take back the Senate, which is looking better and better, and to add a public option to that so that there would be a choice for every American to get covered by health care.
Schakowsky said the presidential election isn't just about the future of healthcare, but the current crisis.
With President Biden, I think we'll certainly be able to do some things about the virus. There'll be some national leadership.
So what does Schakowsky say about the future of healthcare for college students? Will the ACA mandates that insurance providers that offer dependent child coverage allow adult children to stay on their parents' health insurance until age 26? But what happens if the ACA does not survive the upcoming congressional term or the Supreme Court challenge?
Once they're out of school, they would, and not able to be on their parents' policies, they would lose their health care unless they could pay for it by themselves. And that would be really a devastating thing, given the cost of schooling and, universities, etc.
We turn now to Schakowsky's challenger, Sargis Sangari. I spoke with Sangari about how he would lead Illinois' 9th district through the pandemic.
Should you be elected, what steps would you like to see taken to increase precautions in this district or decrease certain COVID precautions?
Well, look, we're dealing with a virus, and regardless of the steps we take, is a virus. So you're going to have to be reactive to it. We've seen science come out say initially you don't need masks, and then they said you need masks. We've taken precautions, and we found out in studies that right now even the masks are not working because the virus has found a way to get around it. It is just a virus. That's what it is.
But masks do work. There is evidence that if everyone were to wear masks, tens of thousands of lives may be saved.
What's your position on a mask mandate?
Oh, like I told you, science before came out said you don't need one. Then they said put it on. But okay, if you mandate me to put a mask on and it's made in China and it's of low quality, then it's not going to protect me anyway.
The scientists are saying that it will help protect everyone if everyone.
If you manufacture it in the United States and you put American manufacturing to it, not if you ship it from China.
There is evidence that if everyone wears a mask, it will significantly decrease the death toll, and that's
why I wear a mask, and I'm sure that's why you wear a mask.
In 2018, Jan Schakowsky won over 70% of the vote. Joey and Justin.
According to Ballotpedia, during the 2018 midterm election, about 290,000 votes were cast for the 9th district's race, compared to about 327,000 in 2016.
Worsened U.S.-China relations, closed consulates, and a travel ban. Now, Chinese international students say they're concerned about entering the U.S. in the near future. So what changes can they expect following the 2020 election? NNN's Hannah Zhang has more.
Regular visa services at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing and the U.S. Consulates General in Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Shenyang are suspended.
Freshman communication student and Shanghai resident Jasmine Yu had the visa appointment cancelled in July. She has another one coming up in December, but
since so many people want a visa and so many people don't get a visa, everyone's applying for one. So it's honestly really, really hard to actually make an appointment. We're kind of like losing hope right now, I feel like.
For the Chinese students who already have a visa, the situation is not much better.
I have to head back to the States before the spring semester to maintain my status. And in order to do that, I have to go to a third country for 14 days before going back to the States.
On January 31st, President Trump issued a proclamation restricting entry for all non-U.S. citizens who are in China 14 days before entering the U.S. due to the pandemic. Since then, China never went off the U.S. travel ban list. Adding to U.S.-China tensions, on July 21st, the U.S. demanded the closure of Chinese consulate in Houston.
accusing diplomats of acting illegally. In a tit-for-tat response, China closed the U.S. consulate in Chengdu. Professor William Hurst speaks about how the election would change U.S.-China relations. Do you think any of these will be different? Any kind of travel bans and policies will be lifted depending on who wins?
I suspect if Biden wins the election, he would probably look to reopen those consulates eventually. When that would happen and what effect that would have, I don't know. Trump sees, I think, political benefit in exploiting problems in the U.S. relationship with China to distract from domestic issues here. So he may try to continue to restrict travel into the U.S., but I don't know.
What will it take for the travel ban to be lifted?
The rationale for that travel ban is the pandemic, and the U.S. right now does not have that under control. So unless and until the U.S. gets that under control, I don't think China will open travel for U.S. passport holders. Until China opens for U.S. passport holders, I don't think the U.S. will move much towards further opening to Chinese passport holders.
When will travel ban be lifted? When can Chinese international students come to the campus and not stay up for Zoom classes? No matter who wins, uncertainty remains. The mutual distrust between the two countries will not be lifted overnight. Hannah Jiang, Northwestern News Network.
Thanks, Hannah. Stick around for tonight's Final Word.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Northwestern break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
Welcome back. We've heard it again and again. This election is unprecedented in so many ways. But for many undergrads here at Northwestern, this is the first presidential election for which we're eligible to vote, and it could actually be setting the precedent for our civic engagement for decades to come. This election feels different because it is different. For so many of us, there was no trip to the polls, no Northwestern voter van, no moment of euphoria as we tapped the screen next to our preferred candidate's name. We put our ballot in the mail, trusted the system, and hopefully checked diligently to ensure our vote was counted and our voice was heard.
But this election is also different in good ways. Here at Northwestern, we have a history of heading to the polls in droves, voter turnout that outpaces peer institutions. This year, it's not just Northwestern students. As of Monday, nearly 94 million Americans have cast early ballots, almost twice that of 2016. More young people are eligible to vote than ever before, and they hear the call of civic duty loud and clear. Despite the war waging against disinformation online, young people have turned to social media in a remarkable display of modern mobilization.
Joke all you want about 2020, but Americans, especially young Americans, recognize this year the privilege of voting. As first-time presidential voters ourselves, it's inspiring to see our fellow students, our parents and professors, our grandparents engaging and educating one another. This will be the election we tell our kids, maybe even their kids, about. The year we voted and we cheered from home, of course, as everyone around us did too.
We have to trust that this won't just be a phenomenon every 4 years. Americans, and young people in particular, have the opportunity to stay politically engaged at all times. Don't just elect your leaders, hold them accountable, and help them meet your expectations. Do it not just for you and your future, but for your family, friends, and your fellow Americans, especially those who face oppression.
As a free and fair press, we promise we'll do the same. That's all we have for you tonight. NNN will be posting election updates regularly on social media, so stay tuned.
For all of us here at NNN, I'm Justin Sweetwood.
And I'm Joey Safchik. Stay safe and stay informed.